My parents often told me I was their biggest mistake, and for the first 2 decades of my life, they made sure I was treated like one. I was their shadow, their live-in servant, and eventually, the unpaid nanny for my golden child sister's kids. I fought my way out of that house with nothing but grit and student loans, believing I was finally free. So years later, when they called me with a demand so shockingly entitled, it forced a laugh from my throat. They were stunned when I finally gave them an answer they had never, in their wildest dreams, expected. I was never supposed to exist. It isn't a poetic metaphor or some self-pitying exaggeration I cooked up in therapy. It's the foundational truth of my life, stated as plainly and as frequently as pass the salt at the dinner table. My sister Lily was their miracle baby. She was planned, prayed for, and cherished from the moment the pregnancy test showed a faint pink line. I was the oops kid, the accident, the human error that slipped through the cracks of their birth control and their meticulously crafted 5-year plan. They didn't want me, but they had me anyway. Out of a sudden surge of parental love, but out of a paralyzing fear of shame from their church and gossiping neighbors. From day one, I wasn't a joy. I was a debt, a burden. My mom had a way of saying it that could chill you to the bone. She'd be in the kitchen, staring out the window at nothing, would say out of the blue that they were done after Lily, her voice holding the same flat, tired tone she used when talking about a pair of expensive shoes she regretted buying. My father was less direct, but more cutting. He'd look at the bills spread across the table and sigh, mentioning how much simpler things were when they were a family of 3. It was a language of hints and omissions, a constant reinforcement that my presence was an inconvenience that cost them. This translated into a clear role for me in the household. I was to make myself useful. While Lily's childhood was a protected bubble of playdates and piano lessons she didn't want, mine was a regimen of chores. I was the one mowing the lawn in the blistering summer heat, the one taking out the trash, the one cleaning the gutters in the fall. I remember one Saturday, I was outside struggling with the lawnmower, while Lily and her friends were in the living room, laughing as my mom served them lemonade. She didn't even glance out the window. My utility was simply expected. My achievements were seen through the same lens. When I brought home straight A's, it wasn't a cause for celebration. It was the bare minimum expected of someone who had to justify their existence. My dad once looked at my perfect report card, nodded once, and told me that at least I could make myself useful one day. Not proud, not grateful, just useful. The most painful moments were when my usefulness wasn't enough to even register on their radar. In my junior year, I was a starter on the varsity soccer team. We made it to the regional championship. I scored the winning goal in the final 2 minutes, a header that sent the crowd into a frenzy. As my teammates dogpiled me, I remember scanning the bleachers, my heart pounding with a desperate, foolish hope, searching for my parents' faces. The spot I told them I'd saved was empty. They never came to a single game. When I got home that night, clutching the championship trophy, my mom just told me to take my muddy cleats off before I walked on her clean floor. But the moment I truly understood, deep in my bones, how profound their resentment toward me was, happened on a rainy Tuesday in 5th grade. My mom forgot to pick me up from school. I sat on the cold, wet steps of the main entrance, watching every other kid get picked up, one by one. The sky grew darker. The rain fell harder, soaking through my jeans. The janitor came out, the jingle of his keys echoing in the empty hall, and locked the main doors behind me with a sympathetic look. I just sat there, shivering, making excuses for her in my head. Maybe there was traffic. Maybe she got a flat tire. Maybe she forgot what time school ended. When her car finally pulled up to the curb, nearly an hour late, a wave of relief so powerful it almost made me cry washed over me. I opened the car door, but before I could get in, she looked at me, her face a mask of pure annoyance. There was no apology. No, "Are you okay?" She just told me, in a clipped, angry tone, that I was old enough to walk and that next time I should just do that. Then she unlocked the door. It wasn't just neglect. It was a message, delivered as clearly as a telegram. I was on my own. And that message would only get louder over the years. In our household, there were 2 sets of rules, 2 separate realities existing under one roof. Lily's world was a soft, forgiving place where mistakes were learning experiences and consequences were optional. My world was a landscape of harsh expectations and swift, disproportionate punishment. My most glaring example of this was the car incident. When Lily was 17, she took my dad's new sedan as pride, and Joanne crashed it into a mailbox while texting. She came home in tears, and my parents rushed to her side, hugging her, checking her for scratches, consoling her as if she had just survived a natural disaster. The mangled front bumper was an afterthought. They never even made her pay the $500 insurance deductible. They just kept telling her that everyone makes mistakes, and the important thing was that she was okay. A few months later, I was helping my mom carry groceries, and her phone, which she'd asked me to carry, slipped and fell onto the driveway. The screen shattered. The torrent of rage that erupted from her was terrifying. She screamed at me for 20 minutes, calling me careless, clumsy, and ungrateful, accusing me of not valuing anything because I didn't earn my own money. She then forced me to take every dollar I had saved from mowing lawns, $207, to be exact, hand pay for the brand new replacement. It had taken me an entire summer to earn that money. My mistake cost me my entire savings. Lily's mistake, which was far more expensive and dangerous, cost her nothing. This favoritism bled into every aspect of our lives, especially during holidays. Christmas was a theatrical performance starring Lily. She'd be surrounded by a sea of brightly wrapped packages, and the ceremony of her opening them could last for hours. My parents would watch with rapt attention, oohing and awing over every new iPhone, every pair of designer shoes, every gift certificate. My gifts were an afterthought. I'd usually get a few pairs of socks and maybe a sweater handed to me after her spectacle was over. The message was clear. She was a joy to be celebrated. It was an obligation to be met. The worst part was that Lily didn't just passively enjoy her status. She actively wielded it as a weapon. She knew she was the favorite and took pleasure in reminding me of my place. If I was excited about something, she'd whisper that maybe if I weren't so boring, Mom and Dad would like me more. She would casually bring up my accidental status in front of her friends, framing it as a funny family quirk. She knew it humiliated me, and she enjoyed it. One year, I finally saved up enough money to buy a video game I'd wanted for months. The day after I bought it, I came home to find it missing. Lily just smirked and said she'd borrowed it to a friend. I never saw it again. When I tried to tell my parents, they told me not to be selfish and to learn how to share. I learned to expect nothing. When I was 15, I finally had a small group of close friends on the soccer team. My birthday was coming up, and for the first time I felt like I had people I wanted to celebrate with. I spent a week working up the courage to ask my mom if I could just have 3 of them over for a pizza and a movie. I found her in the kitchen and asked nervously, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't even look up from the magazine she was reading. She just asked flatly if that was really necessary. The question hung in the air, thick with dismissal. I mumbled that it wasn't, and spent my birthday in my room, listening to the sound of her and my dad laughing with Lily in the living room downstairs. The rules were different for me, and Lily didn't just know it. She was the one who helped enforce them. The situation in our house escalated from a chronic illness to a critical emergency the year Lily turned 19. She announced her pregnancy at the dinner table on a Sunday, not with fear or uncertainty, but with a strange, dreamy look in her eyes. She placed her hands on her still flat stomach and declared that she was having a baby, framing it not as a consequence of irresponsibility, but as a spiritual sign that motherhood was her true destiny. I braced myself for the explosion, for the lectures about poor choices, and derailed futures that I knew would have been aimed at me if I'd so much as gotten a detention. But the explosion never came. My parents didn't even blink. My mother burst into tears of joy, rushing over to hug Lily, already gushing about being grandparents. They didn't ask about the father, who Lily admitted she wasn't sure about. They didn't ask about her lack of a job or a degree. All they saw was a new, exciting accessory for their performance of a perfect family. I just sat there, a cold knot of dread tightening in my stomach. I knew with absolute certainty who would be expected to pick up the slack. After the twins were born, Lily's enthusiasm for her spiritual destiny lasted about 2 weeks. It was fun as long as it involved cute outfits and Instagram posts. But the moment the reality of 2 a.m. feedings, colic, and endless diaper changes set in, her calling mysteriously faded. She barely lifted a finger. Her days consisted of sleeping until noon, going out with friends for hours, and complaining about how exhausted she was. The actual work of motherhood fell squarely on the shoulders of my parents and increasingly on me. I was 17, a high school senior drowning in AP classes, desperately trying to keep my GPA pristine for the scholarships that were my only ticket out. But my nights were no longer my own. My life became a sleep-deprived nightmare. The piercing shriek of a baby monitor would jolt me awake at all hours. I'd stumble into the nursery, the air thick with the smell of sour milk and baby powder, and go through the robotic motions of warming a bottle, changing a diaper and rocking a screaming infant back to sleep, all while my own biology screamed for rest. Lily, meanwhile, would be sound asleep in her room, the door firmly shut. If I dared to knock on her door for help, she'd either ignore it or emerge with a sleep mask on, angrily telling me she needed her beauty rest and that I was better with them anyway. My schoolwork, once my sanctuary and my escape route, began to suffer horribly. I remember one night vividly. I had a major AP calculus exam the next day, a test that could determine college credit. I was at my desk, my textbook open, trying to force my exhausted brain to focus on derivatives. Just as I started to make some progress, my door flew open. Lily stood there, phone in hand, and announced she was going out, not asking, telling. She said a friend was having a crisis and needed her. Before I could protest, she was gone, leaving me with two fussy, wide-awake babies for the rest of the night. I never even opened my textbook again. Took the exam the next day on zero sleep, my mind a complete fog. I failed it. When my teacher pulled me aside, his face etched with concern. Asking what was going on with me, I just mumbled an excuse about being stressed. How could I explain that my future was being sacrificed, night by night, at the altar of my sister's convenience? My parents were no help. In fact, they were enablers. They'd praise me for being so responsible and mature, framing my servitude as a virtue. It allowed them to maintain their own lives, to go out for their date nights, leaving me a 17-year-old, in charge of two infants. I was living in a pressure cooker, and the only thing that kept me from completely breaking down was the singular, shining hope of a college acceptance letter. It was more than an admission. It was a promise of a different life, a lifeline I could use to pull myself out of the suffocating darkness of that house. I held onto that hope with everything I had. But I had no idea they had already found a way to take that from me, too. The acceptance letter to my first-choice university arrived on a dreary March afternoon. It was a thick, heavy envelope that felt like the most important object in the world. I didn't open it in front of anyone. I took it to my room, closed the door, and sat on my bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. With trembling fingers, I tore it open. The first word I saw was congratulations. I didn't shout for joy. A wave of sheer, unadulterated relief so powerful it buckled my knees washed over me, and I just cried. Tears of exhaustion and desperation, and for the first time in a long time, hope. This wasn't just paper and ink. It was a key. It was a tangible, physical exit sign from the prison my life had become. After I composed myself, I went downstairs, clutching the letter like a holy relic. I still harbored a foolish, childish fantasy that this achievement, this undeniable proof of my hard work against all odds, would finally elicit a flicker of pride from them. I was a fool. My dad glanced at the letter, gave a single, non-committal nod, and turned back to the TV. My mother's first question wasn't congratulations. It was a cold, practical, how are you going to pay for it? That's when the floor fell out from under my world. They sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where they had announced their joy over Lily's pregnancy, and explained the situation. They spoke in calm, reasonable tones, as if discussing the weather. The college fund they had supposedly been contributing to since I was born was gone, completely empty. They had used it to fund Lily's soul-searching trip to Europe before the twins were born. And the rest, they explained, had been drained by the mountain of baby expenses that followed. They didn't apologize. They didn't even seem to think there was anything wrong with what they had done. They presented it as a simple, unavoidable fact. The words hit me, but my brain couldn't process them. All those years of getting socks for Christmas while she got iPhones, of me working to save for a car while she crashed theirs with no consequences. It all culminated in this. They had literally taken my future and handed it to her. The silence in the room was deafening. I felt a cold, hollow sensation spread through my chest. It wasn't about the money. It was the final, undeniable proof that in their eyes, I was not a son to be invested in, but a resource to be sacrificed. The final straw, the thing that shattered the last bit of my composure, was my mom's suggestion. She told me I should reconsider my plans. She said that maybe I should look at the local community college, get a part-time job, and stay home. You know, she said, looking at me with what she probably thought was a kind expression, to help out. The family needs you right now. That was it. My dream, my one and only escape plan, was being casually dismissed so I could be permanently chained to my role as the family servant. That's when something inside me snapped. The despair turned into a white-hot rage. I was not going to let them destroy me. I stood up from the table and told them, my voice quiet but shaking with intensity, that I was going to my university one way or another. The next 2 months were a blur of frantic energy. I lived in the school library, applying for every student loan and grant I could find. I picked up a second part-time job washing dishes on weekends, running on nothing but caffeine and sheer defiance. I barely slept. I barely ate. But every time I felt like collapsing, I would picture my mom's dismissive face, and it would fuel me to keep going. The day I left for college, the atmosphere in the house was thick with unspoken anger. Lily didn't even look up from her phone to say goodbye. My mom put on a tearful performance, accusing me of abandoning them in their time of need. My dad just gave me a grim look and warned me not to burn bridges. As I packed the last box into my rusty old car, I knew the bridges were already nothing but ash. As I drove away, watching that house shrink in my rearview mirror, I took my first deep, clean breath of freedom. I thought I was finally free. I was wrong. Their silence was only temporary, and their next demand would be bigger and more insulting than I could have ever imagined. Life at college wasn't the idyllic escape I had envisioned. Yes, I was free from the daily scrutiny and the suffocating atmosphere of my home, but that freedom came at a steep price. I was drowning in student loans, juggling a heavy course load with 3 part-time jobs just to cover rent for a tiny room, buy overpriced textbooks, and survive on ramen and coffee. I worked in the campus cafeteria, cleaned dorm bathrooms on the weekends, and tutored lazy business majors who paid me to essentially do their homework for them. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. There were weeks I was so bone-tired that the world felt like it was moving in slow motion. But even in that relentless grind, there was a deep satisfaction. Every dollar I earned was mine. Every exam I passed was a victory I had achieved on my own. I was building a life brick by painful brick, and it belonged to me. For the first few months, my family left me alone. The silence was a bomb, but I knew it was temporary. The first call came on a cold Tuesday night in October. It was my mom. A familiar sense of dread coiled in my gut as I answered. She didn't ask about my classes. She launched right into a litany of complaints. How tired she was, how fussy the twins were, how Lily was so overwhelmed and needed a break. It was a carefully orchestrated prelude to the real reason for her call. She told me they were short on cash for the month and needed me to send home a few $100s for diapers and formula. I stood in my tiny room, looking at my own empty ramen cupboard, and felt the sheer audacity of her request. A few $100s was my food budget for the entire month. The conditioned guilt rose up in me, but it was drowned out by a newer, stronger emotion, indignation. For the first time in my life, I told her no. I explained calmly that I couldn't, that I was barely surviving myself. The shift in her voice was immediate. The pitiful, tired tone vanished, replaced by a cold, razor-sharp edge. She accused me of being selfish and ungrateful, of having forgotten all the sacrifices they'd made for me. She told me that the big city had changed me. I just said she was right. It had. Then I hung up, my hand shaking. But I didn't feel regret. Felt like I had just won a small, crucial battle. The next battle came a few months later, right before the Thanksgiving break. This time, it was my dad. He tried a different tactic, a reasonable man-to-man tone. I said they didn't want to bother me, but they really needed a favor. He wanted me to come home for the holiday. For one insane second, I thought he might actually miss me. Right. But then he laid out the real request. They didn't want me home to share a turkey. They needed me home to babysit the twins for the entire 4-day weekend, so that he, my mom, and Lily could get a much-needed rest. He even had the nerve to frame it as what my contribution to the family could be. The request was so stunningly tone-deaf I was speechless. I calmly explained that I couldn't come home because I had picked up extra shifts at all my jobs, as it was the only way I could make rent for December. That's when his reasonable father mask slipped. His voice grew hard. He accused me of making excuses that my dishwashing job couldn't possibly be more important than family. He snarled that I must think I was too good for them now. When I hung up the phone that second time, the harsh truth became crystal clear. Physical distance meant nothing. To them, I would never be a person with his own life and his own needs. I was a resource, a backup plan, safety net to be deployed whenever it was convenient for them. As I stared out my window at a life I was fighting so hard to build, I finally understood. I wasn't truly free. I had only escaped the building, but the inmates still had my number. I just didn't know that their next call would come with a demand so big it would force me to burn the entire prison to the ground. Years passed in a quiet, productive rhythm, as the frantic, caffeine-fueled desperation of my college years slowly gave way to the steady hum of adult life. I graduated with honors, landed a solid job in my field, and eventually saved enough to put a down payment on a small one-bedroom condo in the city. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Every piece of furniture, every book on the shelf, was a testament to a life I had built for myself from scratch. The silence from my family had become my new normal. After those 2 failed attempts to pull me back into their orbit during my first year of college, they seemed to have given up. The peace was the most valuable thing I owned. I had built a fortress around my new life, and for a few blissful years the walls held. But of course, they eventually found a crack. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. It was my dad. I hadn't heard his voice in nearly 4 years. My heart didn't seize with dread this time. It was more like the weary resignation of someone who knew a storm was coming. I answered, my voice neutral. "Hello?" He launched into an overly cheerful, fake pleasant routine, asking about my job, my condo, the weather, as if we were a normal family catching up. I let him talk for a minute before cutting him off. "What do you need, Dad?" A heavy sigh on the other end. The act dropped. He began to explain that they had found a perfect little apartment for Lily and the twins. He described it in detail, trying to sell me on it 2 bedrooms, a small yard for the kids, a great school district. He said the rent was steep, but in a stroke of luck, the place was also for sale. And he thought, given the market, that buying it would be a smarter financial move. I stayed silent, a cold, familiar feeling creeping up my spine. I knew what was coming. The pitch was just a prelude to the demand. And then he said it, his voice shifting into a tone of someone suggesting a brilliant, mutually beneficial idea. "We were thinking, since you're doing so well for yourself, maybe you could buy it for her. It's an investment." I actually laughed. It wasn't a sound of amusement. It was a sharp, dry, bitter bark of a laugh that escaped my throat before I could stop it. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it was almost impressive. "Buy a house for Lily," I repeated, my voice dripping with an incredulity that bordered on hysteria. I just spent every cent I had on a down payment for my own 700-square-foot condo. "You want me to buy a house for her?" His voice turned serious, the faux-cheerfulness gone. He launched into the familiar script, the one I knew by heart. He told me Lily couldn't afford rent, that she was a struggling single mother. He told me that he and my mom were getting older, that their retirement savings were thin, that they couldn't keep supporting her forever. He was painting a picture of them as martyrs, sacrificing everything for their precious golden child. I felt the blood rush to my face, but I kept my voice ice cold. "That sounds like a you problem, Dad. You created it." He didn't like that. The pleading tone vanished, replaced by the sharp edge of manipulation. He reminded me that she was my sister, that her kids were my nephews, that they deserved a stable home. "Then she should get a job and provide one," I shot back. The conversation was going in circles. I could hear the rising desperation in his voice, and when desperation didn't work, it turned into a threat. His voice dropped, becoming cold and hard. He told me that if I didn't do the right thing for my family, they might have to explore their legal options to compel me to provide support. I could have hung up. I could have screamed at him. But instead, a strange, profound sense of calm washed over me. The fear was gone. He had no power over me anymore. "Go ahead," I said, my voice even and steady. "Explore your legal options. Sue me." I would love to see how that holds up in a court of law. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought my defiance would finally make them back down. Instead, they decided to declare a loud war. The harassment started the next day. It was a coordinated multi-front assault. My parents called me relentlessly from their numbers. When I blocked them, they called me from my mother's friend's phone. The texts flooded in, a deluge of guilt and accusation. When I blocked every number I could think of, they deployed their flying monkeys. Aunts, uncles, and cousins I hadn't spoken to in a decade were suddenly messaging me on social media, their words all variations on the same tired theme. One aunt sent me a long message about how my mother was crying all the time and how I was breaking her heart. A cousin told me that family helps family and that I had a moral obligation to help my sister. The hypocrisy was so potent it made me dizzy. Where was all this family when I was 17, running on 3 hours of sleep to raise someone else's children? Where were they when I was working 3 jobs in college to avoid starvation? They didn't get to lecture me on loyalty. The final straw was a voicemail my father left me. His voice was no longer pleading or even angry. It was cold and menacing. He warned me that there would be consequences if I continued to embarrass the family by refusing my duty. Said I wouldn't like how ugly things could get. That was it. That was the moment I decided I was done. I was done being their secret keeper. Was done protecting their public image while they destroyed my private peace. I saved the voicemail. I sat down at my computer, the blue light of the monitor illuminating my quiet, peaceful apartment, the very peace they were trying to shatter. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was from a sense of righteous, long overdue fury. And I started to type. I laid it all out, not as a rant, but as a calm, chronological testimony. 2 decades of being the unwanted child. The blatant, soul-crushing favoritism, the years of servitude as an unpaid nanny, the stolen college fund, the harassing phone calls, and finally, their absurd demand that I buy their golden child a house, complete with my father's final threatening voicemail. I didn't use hyperbole, I just stated the facts. Then, I hit share. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. My phone began to buzz incessantly, but it wasn't them. It was a flood of support. Friends from high school, who remembered how tired I always was, coworkers expressing their shock, and then the messages from family. A few cousins messaged me privately apologizing, saying they had only ever heard my parents' side of the story and had no idea it was that bad. My reality, which had been denied and invalidated my entire life, was finally being seen. And then, late that night, the call I was waiting for came through. My parents' number. I knew it wouldn't be an apology. It was the sound of a cornered animal, and it was filled with pure, unadulterated rage. My father's voice was trembling with fury on the phone. He skipped the pleasantries and went straight to screaming, demanding I take the post down immediately. He yelled that I was a disgrace, that I was humiliating them, that I was airing the family's dirty laundry for the whole world to see. I let him scream. I leaned back in my chair, listening to him expend all his impotent rage, and I felt nothing but a profound sense of detachment. When he finally ran out of breath, I spoke, my voice calm and even. Your actions are what's humiliating, Dad, not my telling the truth about them. He threatened to sue me again, this time for defamation. He was grasping at straws. Go ahead, I said, my voice still quiet. Please do. It would give me a chance to play that lovely voicemail you left me for a judge. I still have it saved, by the way. A dead, complete silence on the other end of the line. In that moment, I could feel the power dynamic which had defined my entire life shift permanently. The fear was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. He had no moves left. He knew it. I was no longer the child they could bully and manipulate into submission. I was the one in control now, and I laid out my terms. I told him I would take the post down on one non-negotiable condition. They had to agree to cease all contact with me, completely and permanently. No calls, no texts, no emails, no showing up at my door, no sending relatives to do their bidding. The price for my silence on social media was their permanent, absolute silence in my real life. He didn't agree. He just sputtered for a moment before hanging up. They haven't agreed yet. And so the post stays up, a public monument to their choices. The harassment has stopped. The phone calls, the texts, the messages, all of it has gone silent, because now there are witnesses. Some nights, I sit in my quiet condo and wonder if I did the right thing. But then, I remember the profound, unshakable peace I feel in my own home, the freedom of a life that is truly mine, a life I built not just from scratch, but from the ashes of the one they tried to burn down. I used to think that cutting off your family was the worst thing you could do. I don't believe that anymore. Some families build you up, others break you. Mine chose to build my sister by systematically breaking me. But I picked up the pieces, and I put myself back together, stronger. They had every chance to treat me like a son. They chose control. They chose convenience. So I chose freedom. And that, finally, is a choice I will never regret.